Welcome, everybody. Hi, my name is Lisa Jordan. I'm the Managing Director of the IEA, and I am the Executive Director of the Executives Association of Charlotte in Charlotte, North Carolina. Excited to be here with you all today. Seen some of you on previous webinars, so nice to have you back joining us once again. These webinars are free for you to attend and free for you to host. So if you have a great topic that would be of interest to business owners across the US and Canada, I would love to have a conversation with you and see if we can't get you scheduled to host your own webinar in the coming months here. I know we still have some slots available for 2026. Before I introduce Kelly, I want to put in a quick plug for the IEA conference. It's coming up this September, September 30th through October 2nd in Akron, Ohio. We'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the IEA alongside the Akron Executives Association. We're excited. We just announced last week our speaker lineup. You can find that on our website. And we have a great social event planned. We're heading to Cleveland for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it's going to be a great conference, a great way to kind of put names with faces. All these people you see on the Zoom screens on these webinars, you can actually meet and talk to in person. And it's going to be a great event, great opportunity to learn some practical business tips and as well as things for your business and your association. Biggest thing to know about the IEA conference is the early bird pricing is ending on May 1st. So would love for you to register if you plan to attend. The very lowest price you're going to get ends May 1st. After that, I think it goes up by maybe, I don't know, Cindy, $50, $75 or something.
I think it's $75 or something like that.
Okay. So if you want the best deal, now's the time. Okay. Enough of my blabbing on. I know you're here to see Kelly and not me. So let me introduce Kelly. Kelly Madigan serves as the Vice President of Madigan Security Consulting and Investigations, a firm that has been proudly part of the Seattle Executives Association since 1996. As both a licensed Washington State attorney and a licensed private investigator, Kelly brings a rare combination of legal insight and investigative expertise to the complex world of hiring and risk management. Kelly is deeply committed to helping business leaders make informed, confident decisions that protect their people, their reputation, and their bottom line. Take it away, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm very happy to be here today. As Lisa said, my name is Kelly Madigan, and I'm with Madigan Security Consulting and Investigations. We are located in the Seattle area, and we are a licensed private investigation firm and security consulting firm. Been in business, it's hard to believe, of 30 years, which is really hard to believe. My dad started go to my little bio slide here. My dad, Larry Madigan, started the company after many years of working in the financial world. He was the vice president of a bank called Seafirst, which got bought by Bank of America. He was the vice president of security and started the firm in 1996. I came over in 2014. I left the law firm that I was working at and decided to join the family business to run the legal investigation group of the business. I thought that was an opportunity to grow that, which we've done. As Lisa said, we've been part of Seattle Executives since 1998. I was the president in the dreaded COVID year. I was the president for an entire year, which was a very interesting time to be the president of a networking association, but it was a really cool and unique opportunity to do that. And I'm proud of the time that my presidency. Just quickly on me, like Lisa said, I'm a licensed attorney, been so since 2008, and I am a licensed private investigator in the state of Washington. In order to have a private investigation firm, you have to be a licensed private investigator. So everyone that works for our company is a licensed private investigator. And throughout my years, I bring extensive litigation and legal investigation experience. So just a little bit about me, and I'll just jump into the meat of this presentation today. So I put together just a short slide on what we'll cover today. It's going to be fairly broad strokes. There is going to be unfortunately, some boring legal portion of this, but that's just part of pre-employment background checks. We have to be legally compliant when we do them. And so I wanted to give sort of the broad strokes on the laws that govern pre-employment background checks. I'm not going to dive too deep into those. And I'm going to look at this sort of across the nation. And I'm even going to touch on Canada because I heard there may be a few people on here from across the border. So today what we'll cover is we'll go through the legal framework of pre-employment background checks, both from a national and a state level, even a Canadian level. I will make a business case of why employers should do pre-employment background checks. I came up with what I call my top 10 list of why employers should do pre-employment background checks. I'm going to go through some industry specific requirements. Certain industries have very, very specific requirements, and they may affect some of you that are on the call today. And I just think it's important for you to understand those, and they're ever changing. And then I've got some case studies. Some are nationally, some lawsuits that have come out in recent years regarding negligent hiring practices and then not following the legalities of pre-employment background checks. And I have some fun case studies of things that we've worked on recently. Everyone always wants to ask me, tell me stories about what you do, because we do some interesting stuff. So I've got some recent case studies. I came up with some best practices for pre-employment background checks. And then I just wanted to go through current trends because the last few years, there's been a lot of changes. And as everyone knows, AI is changing everything very quickly. And that is even happening with pre-employment background checks. So let me just jump in here. We're going to start with the federal framework because basically the federal framework for pre-employment background checks it's essentially the floor. So every state has to follow the federal laws when an employer is running a pre-employment background check. And the most important law that governs pre-employment background checks in the US is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Some of you may have heard it before. It's usually called FERCA. And it requires the number one thing that you got to remember with this is that it requires that all employers that are going to run a pre-employment background check get written consent from the applicant before they run the background check. So it's specific forms that have to be used. They're standalone forms. They have to be signed. And you have to allow the employee to review it and give a reasonable response time. And the look back for non-convictions, non-felonies is 7 years. So you can look back 7 years in someone's history. And there's a lot of state laws that go into that, but that's sort of the national standard. The other laws that are important to keep in mind are Title VII and the EEOC guidelines. And that's what we've all heard of before. So that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, genetic info, and age. And all background check decisions that are made after a pre-employment background check is conducted must be in compliance with those rules. And the EEOC really emphasizes and encourages employers to look at each background check on an individual assessment basis and not to have a blanket policy, but to have it match up with the job that the person is applying to, and have companies look at kind of a case-by-case basis in order to reduce discrimination. There is also a law called the Federal Fair Chance Act, and that involves federal agencies and government contractors. So if you have any government contracts getting paid by the government for anything, you have to also comply with the Federal Fair Chance Act. And then finally, record keeping. The laws are very strict. You have to keep the application, the report, and the application for a year. And I actually recommend you keep it for at least 3 years. I think that's just best practice, just to comply with, because most states have more strict guidelines, and we'll get to that on the next slide here. All right, so I'm going to start with, these are the more state specific, and I can't go through all 50 states. Every state has different rules, but I wanted to touch on my home state of Washington, and then I'm going to talk about California, and then I'm going to talk about some of the least restrictive states. So Washington and California are two of the most stringent states on pre-employment background checks. They have their own specific rules that you have to adhere to that have stricter guidelines than the federal laws. So again, like I said, the federal laws are really just the floor, and they go up from there, with Washington being one of the strictest. And so, for example, in Washington, it's sort of, the law is that you can only look back 7 years in someone's criminal history if the job job pays under $20,000. But really, best practice in Washington is that 7 years is the look back period in Washington. Another interesting wrinkle in Washington is the cannabis use. Cannabis is legal in Washington, so employers cannot make decisions on off-duty marijuana use or a positive pre-employment test showing cannabis use. Now, there's exceptions to that maybe if there's a federal contract, if they're driving a bus, things like that, transportation, there are caveats to that. But basically, cannabis use cannot be used as a reason to not hire somebody. And the other thing you'll see in Washington, there's specific cities, and this is getting more and more common across the nation, especially in the larger cities, that the cities themselves put in their own very strict pre-employment background check rules. So, for example, in 2013, which I can't believe is now 13 years ago, Seattle enacted the Seattle Fair Chance Act, which basically, it's called Ban the Box. Employers in Seattle can no longer put on a job application and ask someone, check the box if you've been convicted of a felony, and that basically disqualifies the person from that point on for the job. That is now legal in Washington, and we're seeing Ban the Box laws basically enacted in most major cities in the US and a lot of states. So that's just sort of a very snapshot of Washington, which is one of the most restrictive. Now, California is the most restrictive state when it comes to background checks. So the law is, it's a strict 7-year look back period. So if you are doing business in California, your pre-employment background checks for all things can only look back 7 years. There's no caveats to that. They have a similar rule regarding cannabis use as Washington. So in California, cannabis use for off-site, off-duty times cannot be a factor when deciding if you're going to hire someone. And similar to the Seattle Fair Chance Act, several California major cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco have their own specific city guidelines that are more strict than even the California statewide rules that are the strictest in the nation. So, and it's really the trend right now, and we'll talk about trends at the end of the presentation, but the guidelines for pre-employment background checks are getting stricter. And you can see this happening more on a city level, but I think it's going to happen more on a state level as we move forward in the next few years. All right. So I also thought I'd highlight some of the states with the most minimal background check restrictions. Some of this might be some of the states that you folks do business in. Idaho is the most permissive state. Basically, there's no laws in Idaho that are more stringent than what the national federal laws require. Wyoming's are pretty much the same as Idaho. There's a few wrinkles in there, but Idaho and Wyoming I found are the least stringent. So they just have to follow the federal laws, and there's nothing more than that. Florida has notoriously been a very employer-friendly state, and that's still the case. However, after doing some research, it sounds like Florida is going to probably be acting some more stringent laws. But Florida still today, employers can broadly use someone's criminal history to make a determination if they're going to hire them or not. And Georgia and Alabama have similar laws. For example, I mentioned the ban the box. Both these states do not have ban the box laws. But again, I think we're going to see that changing over the next few years. So those are just some states. And then the rest of the states are kind of somewhere in between Washington and California, and then these least restrictive states. And it's really important, if I can stress anything today, depending on what state that you are doing business in, that your HR manager, your hiring manager, whoever does your background checks is making sure that they are staying up to date on the ever-changing state laws and making sure they're both compliant with the state laws and with the federal laws that govern pre-employment background checks. Now, I thought I was talking to Lisa yesterday, and she said there might be some people on here from Canada, which I just thought it would be also interesting just to note. A lot of people think that because we're so close and that the U.S. and Canada does business so often that our rules might be the same, and that's not the case. I've always heard that Canada has some of the strictest privacy laws in the world, and after looking at this and talking to one of my contacts up there, I got confirmation of that. Canada's pre-employment background checks are also have a federal baseline similar to the US, but it's even stricter. And if you look at the slide here, if you don't follow the federal guidelines in Canada, it's a minimum of $100,000 fine for any infraction for not following the privacy laws when conducting a pre-employment background check. So it's not surprising. I wasn't surprised by any of this when I did the research and looked at Canadian laws on this, but that's something to keep in mind if you are doing business in Canada or hiring people in Canada, that you're complying with just even the federal baseline. And similar to Washington, California, and other states, the provinces in Canada also have their own specific pre-employment background check laws that are stricter than the federal baseline. And a few of those are Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. If you have questions about anything with Canada, I have a contact up there that I can connect you with. I'm no expert on Canadian law, and I don't want to be, but I have somebody that I work with up in Canada and British Columbia that can assist with any questions about the Canadian laws. All right. Let's see here. All right, so that's sort of the boring part of my presentation of going through the laws, and I can answer questions about any of the laws, but I wanted to stress that as important as I believe pre-employment background checks are, and I'm going to make a case for that, that also you have to keep in mind that you are using the right company to do them, and that all the laws and guidelines are being followed both on a national and on a state level. So we ask, why do companies do pre-employment background checks? And a lot of this comes down to money. We're all in the business of making money, and there is, a cost benefit analysis that can be done on this. Background checks are pretty inexpensive, but when not done, they can be pretty costly for a company. So I did some research and found some interesting statistics about turnover and hiring and when pre-employment background checks are not done and bad hires are made. So just some interesting, and most of my statistics are from the Society of Human Resource Managers, which is the largest human resource association in the country, and then from the Certified Fraud Examiners Association, which does an annual survey on fraud in the workplace, and they publish that every year. I think the most recent one is 2024. We don't have 2025 yet, but they look at this on an annual basis. Based on the findings here, the key findings that I found, that each resignation that costs up to 1/3 of a worker's annual salary, and 67% is from soft costs like just loss of productivity, other employees feeling unsafe, things like that, not just the hard dollars of having to terminate somebody and then bring somebody else on. There's so many other factors that go into when a bad hire is made. And you can see here the AC, this is the Certified Fraud Examiners. They found in 2024 that internal fraud, so this is an employee committing fraud in a company, cost $145,000 per incident. That's $145,000 lost for that company per incident. And also, this is also a statistic from the ACFE. 44% of resume falsifiers lied on their CVs or on the job application because they lack the qualifications for the jobs. And when you do a pre-employment background check, you can catch this stuff. You can check employment history, you can check education. These are all things that you can check to prevent somebody getting hired for a job that they're actually not qualified for, and then essentially being a bad hire. And based on the U.S. Department of Labor, bad hire costs equal 30% of first year wages. So up to 24%. If you have an $80,000 salary, that's $24,000 of that $80,000 salary if you make a bad hire, which can result by not doing a pre-employment background check. Now, I thought this was interesting, but currently about 95% of U.S. employers are running some form of pre-employment background check, but a lot of those are employers doing them on their own. So they're not hiring a company to do them. They're going and being an internet sleuth on their own. They're going and looking at someone's social media. They're going and maybe doing a Google search and things like that. And that's fine. I think that's a prerogative of a company as long as that's legal in your state. There's nothing wrong with that. But I really recommend hiring, a company who does this every single day to really get the real information, because a lot of what's put out on the internet can be fake. And you could be looking at, it's just not reliable. So you really want to focus on reliable information, and that will tie into my discussion later on liability. So let's see here. All right. So here I decided to put together sort of the top 10 list. I like lists myself. And I decided to put together a top 10 list of why I believe employers should do pre-employment background checks. And the number one reason is the most important reason, in my opinion, and that is workplace safety. And that is safety for both your other employees and your clients, your vendors, anybody who is going to be in your workplace. And at the end of the day, keeping each other safe is really the most important thing. And this is really critical in the industries such as healthcare, education, childcare, and elder care. Whenever I do these presentations or talk to anyone about pre-employment background checks, the thing I try to drive home is if you are working in any of those industries, it is absolutely imperative that you are running pre-employment background checks. The risks are just too high, and the negative outcomes are catastrophic, quite honestly. When you hire somebody who is a lot of times people who want to do damage seek out these industries because that's where they can do the most damage. So I really recommend, if you work in those industries, it is a very small cost to make sure that you are protecting your other employees and your clients. Number two, reducing negligent hiring liability. And I have a few cases to talk about regarding negligent hiring, but basically negligent hiring is when you hire somebody who is not essentially qualified for the job. All employers have a duty of care. And so there's been several very, very large negligent hiring settlements in the jury verdicts and settlements in the last few years. And background checks help document due diligence by the employer to make sure that they're hiring the right person. So for example, if you are running a daycare, you want to make sure you run a background check to make sure you're not hiring a registered sex offender to work in that daycare. And if you don't do that and an incident happens, you would likely open yourself up for a lawsuit for negligent hiring. So that's my number two, and that's probably coming from my lawyer brain. I always look at liabilities and want to protect businesses from creating undue liabilities for themselves. Number three would be verifying credentials and qualifications. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, applicants often lie on their applications and on their CVs about their actual qualifications. You want to make sure that you're verifying degrees, licenses, especially when they're legal, medical, financial, and then also verifying their employment history. We had a company come to us a few years ago, and they don't normally do pre-employment background checks, but they were hiring for a controller, and they felt that they needed to do one because of the nature of the job. And they required that person have a CPA license, and we did the background check, and the person that they were going to hire said they had a CPA license, and they did not. And they just lied about it because they wanted the job. And they definitely had some work history where they were qualified for some of the job, requirements, but they did not have their CPA license, and it was just they flat out lied. And that's so most pre-employment background checks will check that sort of information if it's specific to the job that you're trying to hire for. Another checking credentials here is running a yearly driving record. You can, if you have employees driving company vehicles to and from job sites or to client homes or anything like that, you want to be ensuring that you are checking their driving record on a yearly basis to make sure that they still have a license, they haven't had a DUI, and if they've had a DUI, if they're required to have an interlock device or special insurance. And I'll touch a little bit further on that during one of the case studies, but that is something for any company that has employees driving company vehicles. That is something that is absolutely needed every year to do that. Number 4, it's reducing employee turnover. And we talked about that a little bit ago, but it's been just found through just studies that making the right hire and hiring somebody that's actually qualified for the job reduces turnover. And properly vetted employees are more likely to stay, perform, contribute. And also other employees are more happy when they are surrounded by other qualified people who are doing their job and are able to do so. Let's see here. Number 5, protecting company assets and preventing fraud. As I mentioned earlier, the average fraud incident in the US for a company totals $145,000 per incident. I mean, that's a huge number. And you can prevent a lot of this by performing the pre-employment background check, by looking for things like in their background for theft, embezzlement, and other financial misconduct before providing them access to your system. I have a very recent example of this I'm going to discuss during the case studies, but generally speaking, if somebody generally has a history of running these kind of schemes and they've been caught before, but they often seek out employment with employers that are not going to run a background check so they can continue these types of schemes. So if you have the program, they're likely not going to apply for a job at your company. All right, number 6, regulatory and legal compliance. And I've got a slide on more industry-based compliance in a few minutes, but a lot of industries have very specific requirements that of what needs to be done for a background check. For an example, if you are getting hired to be a teacher, you have to go through the FBI fingerprint background check. That is just a requirement that all educators get that kind of background check. If you are going to be a commercial driver and you need to have drug screening, those are just some examples of things that is mandatory as part of the hiring process. So if you're running if you are doing any types of these businesses that are doing this, you need to make sure you're compliant with the state and federal laws and screening the people properly. All right, number 7. And I think this one is getting more and more relevant in the world of social media, in our cancel culture, and just things going viral, is protecting your brand reputation. So it's been seen over and over again that a single high-profile incident from a preventable bad hire can generate devastating publicity. So one bad thing happens, and that will blow up on social media, and it will be talked on every social media platform, on the news. And customer facing businesses really need to be cognizant of this and make sure that they're hiring the right people for the positions they're hiring. Number 8, build a culture of trust and safety. And what we found as we've come into companies and helped implement background check screening programs is that the other employees start to feel that they feel very safe and that they're working with people who have been vetted, and that the company cares about them to make sure that they're working in a safe environment, and the people are who they say they are. And that's just something we've seen over and over again as we've implemented pre-employment background check programs into companies. Number 9, deter applicant dishonesty. And like I said, if you advertise as part of your job that they're going to need to pass a pre-employment background check, it's less likely that somebody is going to apply for a job. For example, if they have a history of committing fraud, it's not likely they're going to apply for a job at your company because they're going to know that you're going to find that and likely not hire them based on those prior incidents. And you get people that work for you that are more honest, and I think that's good for everybody. And number 10, this is just the drug and substance use of screening. Substance abuse is linked to higher absenteeism, accidents, and workers' comp claims. So if your company is the right company to do drug screening for and also legally permitted in your state, that is a good thing to implement just to prevent these types of things. So that's my top 10 reasons. And I think I've been pretty thorough in coming up with them. And I go back to, though, I mean, really number one is safety. And at the end of the day, we want everyone to be safe, and pre-employment background checks generally will create a safer environment for everyone in the company. All right. So I mentioned that there are some industry specific requirements, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics of these, but the 4 big ones are healthcare, financial services, transportation, and education and government. And for example, in the healthcare industry, if you're getting hired for certain healthcare jobs, you have to be past the OIG and the SAM exclusions. And those are basically lists that they've put together of people who have committed Medicare and Medicaid fraud and other fraudulent incidents that involve the healthcare industry. And that's very healthcare specific. Another thing on the healthcare is that if you're going to be handling controlled substances, you have to pass the FBI fingerprinting background check, and that's a national standard. I mentioned in education that all educators have to also pass the FBI fingerprint background check process. I mentioned that DOT requires alcohol and drug testing. And in the financial services under FINRA, which is the national organization that governs financial advisors and other people in industry, they have certain regulations that bar individuals from getting a license that have had financial crime convictions. And a lot of these jobs require credit checks as well as a pre-employment background check, especially if they're going to be a fiduciary. And the financial sector can get layered depending on your access to things, and there can be more and more checks that are required. The government has a lot of different checks that are required, anti-terrorism checks, and this is all very government specific, and it depends on the type of government contract that you might be working on. And I can answer more questions on that later on, but it's real specific to that specific industry. And this is just a little slide I put together of I just thought, you may ask, why do employers conduct background checks? I think I've made a good business case for it. But I thought this was interesting. This is a compilation of statistics I got from the Certified Fraud Examiners and the Society of Human Resource Managers. But I thought this was probably pretty accurate. 38% say that it has to do with minimizing risk. And I think most companies want to minimize risk as much as possible. The one thing I thought was sort of interesting was the brand reputation being so small. And I think that's going to change as we progress more and more in the world of social media and everything being so public. I think we're going to see that being a much bigger reason why companies want to make sure that they're hiring the people who they think they're hiring and making good hires, because it's really bad situations go viral very quickly. All right. All right, so here's where I think the more fun stuff is, and this is looking at some real life case studies. And this first slide here is on negligent hiring. And as I mentioned, companies open themselves up to claims for negligent hiring when they either don't do pre-employment background checks or they do them and then they ignore the findings. And here are some examples. So the largest negligent hiring case is a recent case out of Texas. And in that case, a field technician for Charter Communications went to the home of 83-year-old Betty Thomas on a service call. And the following day, he went back to the home. He used his company van to get there. He entered the home using his basically identification being a Charter Spectrum employee, and used his company utility knife, and he murdered Betty Thomas. And it was found in the court proceedings that basically the company did not do any pre-employment background check. And if they had, they would have found that he'd been fired from previous jobs for harassment and forgery. And he had a lot of other stuff in his background. And the jury awarded $7 billion, with almost $7 billion of that being in punitive damages, which Texas allows. And it's one of the, I think it right now is the largest negligent hiring verdict in the US. And it just shows you a simple $75 background check probably could have prevented this case and prevented Miss Thomas from being murdered, which is just awful. Another case out of Illinois, Illinois Trucking Company. This one is just sort of atrocious to me. The truck driver, he was hired by a trucking company. He had been fired from 4 previous employers for safety issues. He had 4 felony convictions for using a tire thumper to damage a woman's car. He had multiple speeding violations and reckless driving convictions, all within 7 years of being hired by this company. He also had 4 accidents within 3 years of being hired. The company did perform a pre-employment background check, but decided to ignore it, and they made him a marginal hire, but hired him anyways, which I don't know what that means, but it's strange. Shortly after being hired, he had his CDL suspended. However, they didn't do the yearly checks to see if he actually had his CDL. And he then got into a very, very serious accident. And the company was sued for negligent hiring. And the accident victims got a $54 million verdict against this company. And again, if you just pay attention to the background check, you know, this is like, these are major red flags that came up on the background check. And then choosing to not, for a commercial driver, not checking his driving record yearly is pretty crazy. Another one out of Texas, an employee with a prior weapon conviction, active terrorist threat charge, shot and killed a coworker. So he came into the work and killed a coworker. And if they didn't run a background check on him. If they had, they would have seen that he had an active case going against him, and could have chosen not to hire him. And in that case, the jury awarded $1 million for failing to properly screen and ignoring, in that case, reported warnings about this individual. And obviously that verdict's a lot smaller, but still, I mean, that's $1 million is a lot of money. And also it killed an employee. I mean, the person never should have been working there. And then you'll see various awards across the country, and various cases that have come out. And there's a lot of them. There was a new one filed in Washington just a few months ago, and it's still pending, but there's a lot of these across the country, where daycares and other facilities that care for children either just did not do pre-employment background checks or ignored the findings. Children were abused by employees that were either registered sex offenders or had history of violent and sexual crimes. And there's a recent verdict from about, I think it's like 5 years ago, out of Georgia, that awarded a $60 million verdict for a 15-year-old that was sexually assaulted at one of these child care facilities. So, and that was on a negligent hiring claim. And I believe that person was a registered sex offender. So it's to keep in mind that when background checks would have revealed very serious criminal histories and other incidents in this person's background, the juries are holding the employers accountable for this. And there's just really what they're showing by these verdicts is there's just no defense for skipping doing a pre-employment background check, or by doing it and then just ignoring the findings. All right, and this is, I'm just going to go through this real quickly. And these are just when an employer doesn't do the screening properly. And I'm not going to go into these as much detail, but basically, like I said in the very beginning, the minimum standard is under FERCA, and you have to get signed authorization to run the pre-employment background check. You have to be able to give the person the report if they request it. And they have a right to then also dispute something that may have been inaccurate. And these are some cases: a Wells Fargo, a Domino's Pizza, and an Amazon, where they did not follow the federal laws and their state laws on performing the pre-employment background checks. And we have verdicts ranging from $5 million to $12 million for improperly doing that. So again, make sure you get the written consent, provide the report if the applicant asks for it, and just make sure that you are following all the state laws that are very specific to your jurisdiction for pre-employment background checks, because they can have, pretty big consequences if you don't. But going back to the previous slide, it's we're talking a loss of life and very serious damages to people's lives that happen when you don't do them. All right. So I thought I'd just share a few of our recent things that we've come across in our business. We've been working with a medical practice to do an investigation. This medical practice used to do pre-employment background checks. They decided to not do them for a while for whatever reason, costs, or they felt like they knew they were hiring people that were friends of friends. They hired a new office manager without doing the pre-employment background check. This office manager started telling clients and patients that they were taking cash for certain types of procedures, and she was pocketing that cash, and she defrauded the practice of thousands upon thousands of dollars over like a 2-year period. And we've been working on an active investigation on this and found that she'd been convicted of the exact type of behavior on with 3 separate employers. Served 2 to 3 years in jail, would get out over a 15-year period, and then do the same thing, and is always looking for companies that don't do pre-employment background checks. And if they just done the standard background check, they would have found this and never hired her. It's very interesting in this case too. This person's mother has the same thing. So she learned this from her mother. And it sounds like this goes back 30 years of doing this type of activity and defrauding companies, and then basically just disappearing for a while and then popping back up until the police catch up with her. This is number 2 on this list is a construction company. This was from a few years ago. And it really is to emphasize the type of background check that you're doing. In this case, this construction company, and quite honestly, they were desperate to hire people. This was around the time when building was booming and they really need to hire people, and they were hiring fast. And they only decided to do a Washington check. You can do some background checks can just be state specific. And so they just did a Washington background check, but this applicant had only lived in Washington for 1 year. And after about 6 months, they started having reports of clients, this is residential construction, of clients reporting items stolen from job sites, jewelry, things like that being stolen. And they started investigating, and we helped. And it found out this individual actually had been convicted of murder in the state of Georgia and had got early release from prison because he testified against his co-defendants. And if we had performed the background check and they had performed a national multi-jurisdictional check, this would have revealed his complete criminal history. And he had other things in his past too regarding theft, because the murder was part of a robbery gone wrong. So it just shows that you really have to do the right background check and not just one that's less expensive because you really need to get people in. And our final one is I want to emphasize doing the yearly background screenings for driving records if you have people driving company vehicles. or driving their own vehicles for work. So in this case, this employer allowed their employee to drive a company vehicle without the annual rescreening. Post-hire, this employee received a DUI and was court ordered to have an ignition interlock device in the vehicle at all times, and to have special, in Washington, we have special insurance you have to get when you've had a DUI. This employee got into an accident, very serious accident, in the company vehicle, and the employer's insurance company denied the claim because they were never told, they didn't run the background check, and they did not, and he was driving a vehicle without the interlock device and the special insurance. And that left the employer exposed to full liability to pay for that accident. So these are just some interesting cases that we worked on recently, and it really drives home the importance of doing the pre-employment background check and doing the right pre-employment background check. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into these. I've covered most of this already in my presentation, but these are just sort of best practices, and you can take this presentation and try to implement it. But you really want to have a pre-employment background check policy that you implement for every hire. You want to make sure that your HR team and anyone that's doing hiring for your company is trained in the state laws and the procedures. You want to make sure that you're continually auditing your program and making sure you're staying up to date in the laws. You want to make sure if you're using a vendor to do your background checks that they're FERCA compliant. You want to make sure you are conducting individualized assessments. For example, somebody handling money in the job might be different than somebody who just answers phones. You might have different qualifications for them. And finally, you want to document everything. You want to have at least the minimum 1 year FERCA requirement for retention, and I recommend 3 years. All right. So this is just sort of what's changing and what's coming next in the world of pre-employment background checks. And I mentioned at the beginning of this, laws are getting stricter, and I think we're going to see that continually happen. Laws are just going to get stricter. There's going to be more governance. There's going to be more requirements. But at the same time, on the flip side of that, I think we're going to see juries and courts really look at companies and say, you need to be doing these checks. And if you're not, then you're going to get hit with a negligent hiring lawsuit and potentially a very large verdict. The other kind of two big things here are the cannabis protections. That is spreading very quickly. Even Texas enacted a law in 2025, which is very historically significant for Texas, where they used to have on a job applicant, have you used cannabis? You could check the box and that would disqualify you. You can no longer do that in the state of Texas. And with more and more states legalizing marijuana, we're going to see that being less of a legitimate reason or a legal reason to not hire somebody. And then the probably elephant in most people's room right now is how is AI affecting this? And quite honestly, that's the Wild West right now, of how is AI going to change pre-employment background checks? How are things being verified? And right now, if you ask me in a year from now, I'd probably have a different answer. I mean, I think the most recent EEOC is from 2023. I mean, that's outdated. I mean, we're changing almost on a monthly basis, not a yearly basis anymore in the world of AI. But that is something that hiring managers and companies need to make sure that they're part of. And I think the biggest thing the takeaway you can take from this is that ask your background check company if they're using AI and how they're using it, to make sure that it's being done properly and that you're comfortable with the way it's being used. All right, so just to kind of wrap this up, these are what I consider the 4 pillars of pre-employment background check screenings. Number 1, safety. And as I talked about, it's my number 1 on my top 10 list. Protect your employees, customers, and the public from preventable harm. Number 2, legal protection. Avoid those negligent hiring liability claims and meet the mandatory regulatory requirements. Financial prudence. Background checks cost between like $50 and $200 depending on the scope of them, versus a very large verdict for a negligent hiring claim, plus the culture of your business, any negative publicity you get from something like a case like this, and just making your employees and clients feel safe. And then just workplace quality. So all companies want to have a stable, trusted, high-performing team, and that really starts from who you hire. So that's all I have today. I'm absolutely open for questions. And my contact info is here. And if you have other things that come up later on, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to jump in and answer any questions.
Thanks, Kelly. A lot of insight, a lot of scary stories you share.
Yeah. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but that's the world I work in. So, it really just spending a little money up front can prevent a lot of the scary stuff from ever happening.
For sure. Yeah. And as a consumer, you assume and trust that these businesses have done that work ahead of time, when the vendors come into your home or you send your child off to daycare. I mean, you just kind of take that for granted that that's been done.
Yes, I am honestly surprised sometimes when I find out like certain companies are not doing background checks and they're quite honestly advertising that they are, because they're doing their own, but I just don't feel like that's good enough when you're in, especially those industries, children, financial, and the elderly,
Yeah.
anyone going into someone's home, it's just, or dealing with those types of things, it's just imperative in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And even from an executive association perspective, we have some execs associations across the US and Canada that do background checks on their members before their members join, but that is not commonplace either. I mean, we don't do it in Charlotte. And I know that a lot of associations don't do it, but that's an interesting thing that we should probably all start taking a look at as well.
Yeah, I know for Seattle executives, we do the background checks for everybody that comes in.
Yeah.
And, normally they're very vanilla, quite honestly, business owners are, but we've had a few and it's been pretty surprising what we found. And
Hmm.
I think in the case of just, within our own community here, if we're sharing business and we're recommending somebody, you want to know that they've been vetted and that they are who they say they
Yes.
are. I don't want to recommend someone to, one of my clients who hasn't been properly vetted. So.
Yep. Yep. You're exactly right. Well, does anyone have questions for Kelly?
Kelly, um, thanks for sharing all this. I had no idea the extensive checks that can be done. For us, we're a commercial air conditioning company, so we have 30 trucks on the road, hiring field technicians that represent us and drive our vehicles. They actually drive them home as well. Um, and, I and Marisa can help on this, but we do background checks, but I don't think it's anywhere near the length of which you shared today. And I always thought we were covered. We performed the background check. We have a vendor. I don't know if they're FERCA certified, or compliant. I guess, and I don't know if it's been years, Marisa, that we just settled on the vanilla part of the check and we've not extended it to look at other things that maybe we should be looking at.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to look at that. Yeah, because I think we just do the basic background check and it's just been whoever started this in years past just said this is how it's done. And so definitely something to think about to update ourselves as to like, the current requirements and maybe even pushing it a little bit further to prevent some of these, to promote safety and you know, workforce quality, like you mentioned. Is there a place online to like get all this information? Like for our state, we're in Nevada. So like if we wanted to find out what are like the requirements,
Sure.
we
Let
probably
me,
have it somewhere in a book.
I'm sure there is. I didn't look at Nevada specifically, and I've never looked at Nevada specifically, but I'm happy to just take a look and see what I can find for you. There's a lot of good information out there. And like I know Washington has their own sort of like the Washington EEOC, their like the state version of that has all this. So let me see what I can find, and I'll get you guys' contact, and I'll shoot you over what I can find, and I can also always connect you with somebody in Nevada that does what I do in Washington, and can assist you with that. I have contacts with people through our national associations, in the background check world, in the private investigation world, all over the country. So I'm happy to do that. But yeah, I mean, especially for you guys, I mean, if you have people driving your company vehicles, at the minimum, you guys should be doing a yearly check, and as long as it's legal in the state of Nevada, which I assume it probably is, to make sure that they don't have suspended licenses, they haven't got a DUI, they don't have, other vehicle related, driving related incidents, because that case that I said is real, and it became, and that's not the only one. We have had a lot of these where we've done the check and we're like, oh, this individual got a DUI 3 months ago. Are you aware of that? And the employer goes, no. And they're required to have an interlock device. And plus they got a DUI. I mean, it's problematic just in itself. And they're driving a vehicle. And a lot of insurance carriers will just not allow they will not cover a driver in a commercial setting who's had a DUI. So you got to check with your carrier on that too. So that's just, it's one of those additional things. Unfortunately, when you work in that world of having drivers, you got to make sure that you're doing all that stuff.
Yeah, we do the MVR at the get-go. We do that at the beginning. But you had mentioned a good practice of doing it annually. We
have a lot of clients that we do it annually for. Mm-hmm. And those are all companies that have people who drive company vehicles or drive their personal vehicle for business purposes.
I mean, kind of like you do a drug test or something like that. It's just something you can't just do once and be done with.
Yeah. Yeah.
You may be shocked at this, Kelly, but we do the MVR in the beginning, as Marisa said, but after 57 years in business, we only just started the annual MVR in January this year.
It doesn't surprise. I mean, people just don't think about it. Also, like when you have these people that work for you, you trust them, and if you don't know, but it's that one time where it bites you in the butt, and you have that claim where the carrier just said, no, we're not covering this loss. And this is a very serious car accident and traumatic injuries. We're talking million. And in Washington, even minor injuries can be millions of dollars. So every state's a little different. But and they had to pay that. They had to settle those claims on their own. And I think the carrier, I used to work for an insurance company as an attorney, and I think the carrier, they didn't fight it because I think they were right. Because part of their policy, they could not, that was an exclusion in their policy.
You mentioned having a separate written consent from the candidate for background check. I think what we've been doing is it's just part of our application that they sign off on that we then can perform the background check. How critical is that? Do we need a separate form?
That really depends. I'd have to see it, but okay. FERCA has their, it's pretty specific. FERCA has very specific, I mean, I assume whoever you're using is using a FERCA compliant form. I mean, but I'm happy to take a look at it, but it just has to have certain language in there. What companies used to do is they would bury this in a job application, and it'd be like, 5 pages into a job application, and it'd be like, and people would just sign it, right? Because they're not realizing what they're signing. Mm-hmm. And so essentially the law is it needs to be a standalone paragraph with the right FERCA language that the person is allowing. The one thing that's nice is that before this had to be a wet signature. One thing good that came out of COVID is the Electronic Signature Act. So now they can be electronic signatures, which it saves everybody a lot of time and money. But yeah, it's a real specific form. But if you're using a reputable background check company, they're using a FERCA compliant form. It's not a complicated form. It's just they're trying to avoid people signing something they don't know what they're signing.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, as I mentioned, this is recorded and we will put it on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something or want to go back and watch it or share it with someone, you're welcome to do that. It'll be posted in a couple days, and feel free to reach out to Kelly afterwards if there's anything that you want to follow up with. And thanks for joining us on the call today, everybody.
Thank you,
yes,
Kelly.
Feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Lisa.
Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to answer questions. And John and Marissa, I'll get back to you on the Nevada information, and I'll find a good spot for you guys to get that information.
Kelly, can you share that information with me as well? I'm here in Las Vegas, Nevada as well.
Sure. Yes,
appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very informative.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.